All right, so, you sent over this this HALT Fentanyl Act, and I mean, it's been generating some buzz.
Yeah, it has.
So we're diving deep today into Senate Bill 331, officially the HALT Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act.
Okay.
And, to really make sense of this, we're also taking a close look at the Congressional Budget Office's analysis on what this bill could cost and the broader impact it might have.
Absolutely. And, this is something that goes beyond the headlines, right? We need to look at the actual details of this legislation.
For sure.
And we're going to go deep into what the bill is actually proposing when it comes to this whole world of substances that are related to fentanyl and what the experts over at the CBO are saying about what might happen.
Right.
The goal here is to help you guys listening walk away with a clear understanding of this act.
Okay, so the name HALT Fentanyl Act, pretty straightforward, but then right away the bill starts talking about fentanyl-related substances. So it's not just fentanyl itself, right? What are we actually talking about here?
That's a really important distinction to make.
Yeah.
The bill isn't just about the fentanyl that's already, out there and a problem.
Yeah.
It's introducing this whole new category called fentanyl-related substances.
Okay.
And it defines this category based on how similar these substances are to fentanyl, like structurally at the molecular level.
Structurally similar. So like, if fentanyl was like a Lego creation, these related substances would be like other creations you could make with like slightly different, but similar Lego pieces?
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it.
Okay.
The bill actually outlines 5 main types of modifications that you could make to the fentanyl molecule that would make a substance fall under this fentanyl-related category.
Okay, so 5 types of tweaks to the fentanyl molecule.
Yeah.
What's the first one?
All right, so the first one has to do with a part of the fentanyl molecule called the phenyl group. And within that group, there's a phenyl portion, which is basically a ring-like structure.
Got it.
And the bill says that if you replace that ring with any other single ring structure, the resulting substance is considered fentanyl-related. It's kind of like if you swapped out one circular Lego piece for a different circular Lego piece.
Okay, so one ring for another.
Exactly.
Sounds like that could cover a lot of different possibilities.
Yeah.
What about the second type of modification?
Okay, so the second type is all about making substitutions on the phenethyl group itself.
Okay.
This means like adding or changing small chemical groups.
All right.
We're talking about things like alkyl groups, which are basically simple chains of carbon atoms, or alkyl groups, which are similar, but they have a double bond between some of those carbon atoms.
Okay.
And then there are alkoxyl groups, which is an oxygen atom linked to a carbon chain. Hydroxyl groups, that's an OH.
Okay.
Halogens, like chlorine or fluorine.
Ah.
Halocals, which are carbon chains that have halogens attached to them. Amino groups containing nitrogen.
Yeah.
Or nitro groups.
Okay. Right.
Which is a NaMNO2.
So it's like adding different little accessories or making little changes to that part of the main structure.
Exactly. The third type of modification is actually very similar.
Okay.
But instead of focusing on the phenethyl group, it's focusing on another key part of the fentanyl molecule called the piperidine ring. And again, we're talking about adding or changing those same types of small chemical groups like alkyl, alkoxyl, but we're also including things like esters, ethers, hydroxyls, haloalkylamino or nitro groups attached to this ring.
So even small little changes at the molecular level could make a substance fall into this category.
Yeah.
What are the last 2 ways a substance can become fentanyl related?
All right, so the fourth one involves the aniline ring, which is another ring structure in fentanyl, being replaced by any aromatic monocycle. And it doesn't matter if that new single ring has other things attached to it or not, just swapping that core ring out qualifies it.
Got it.
And then the fifth and final way is a little more complex. It involves replacing the N-propionyl group.
Okay.
Which is a specific carbon-oxygen double bond part of the molecule.
Yeah.
With any other acyl group, which is a related type of chemical structure.
Okay, so this is a really detailed chemical picture we're painting here.
Right.
And there's an important exception in the bill, right? So even if a substance matches one of those 5 structural changes, it's not automatically a fentanyl-related substance if...
Yeah, there are 2 big exceptions here that are designed to prevent any overlap or unintended consequences.
Okay.
First, if the Attorney General has already individually controlled a certain substance through another process, It won't be considered a fentanyl-related substance under this bill.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Right.
We don't want the same substance being regulated in multiple ways.
So,
What's the second exception?
The second one is if a substance is already specifically listed in another schedule of the Controlled Substances Act, so not Schedule I, but any of the other schedules,
Got it.
then it's also excluded from this definition.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's all about avoiding any kind of double regulation.
Okay, so now the bill mentions that the Attorney General can publish a list of substances that they think meet this definition of fentanyl-related.
Right.
But is that list like the final word on it?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
The bill makes it very clear that even if a substance isn't on that published list, it can still be treated as a Schedule I controlled substance if it fits that core structural definition that we just talked about.
Right.
So that definition is really the key mechanism here.
Okay.
The list is more like a guide or for informational purposes.
So the bill casts a really wide net based on the chemical structure. Let's talk about how this actually changes things when it comes to, drug scheduling.
Okay.
What's the current situation with these fentanyl-related substances?
Right.
And how does this bill change things?
Okay. So right now, only a small number of very specific fentanyl-related substances are individually listed as Schedule I in the Controlled Substances Act.
Okay.
However, there's this much larger group of these substances that have been under a temporary Schedule I classification since 2018.
Okay.
And that temporary classification is set to expire on March 31st, 2025.
Oh, wow. So this bill is coming in right as that's about to run out.
Exactly. It's really coming in at a critical time.
So what happens to that temporary status if this bill passes?
This bill would essentially make that temporary Schedule I placement automatic and permanent.
Okay.
For any substance that meets the fentanyl-related definition,
Got it.
with those two exceptions that we talked about.
Permanent schedule. So from anyone listening who maybe isn't super familiar with drug scheduling, Schedule I is basically for substances that don't have a currently accepted medical use
Right.
and have a high potential for abuse.
Right. That's exactly right. And this bill wants to put this whole class of fentanyl-related substances into that category permanently.
Okay, and just to be clear, fentanyl, the drug we all know as fentanyl, where does it fit into all this?
So this is important. Fentanyl itself would not be moved to Schedule I by this bill.
Right.
It would stay classified as a Schedule II drug under the Controlled Substances Act.
Got it.
This bill really focuses on these substances that are structurally related to fentanyl, but not fentanyl itself.
So the goal is to permanently control this whole family of fentanyl derivatives.
Right.
Now, the bill also includes some really specific changes about research registration, which might seem a little bit separate from the goal of, stopping trafficking.
Okay.
So why the focus on research?
Well, while the main goal is definitely to, control these dangerous substances, the bill also kind of acknowledges that we need to understand them better.
Yeah.
And that means scientific research.
Right.
And the hope is that this could lead to treatments for overdoses or addiction or other ways to, counter the effects. So the bill tries to offer a faster and potentially alternative registration process, specifically for researchers who want to work with these Schedule I controlled substances.
Okay.
But there's some specific conditions that come with it.
So faster procedures for research, who gets to use this fast track?
It's mainly for two types of research. The first is research that involves a drug that's under what's called an investigational use exemption from the FDA, often called an IND, which means that the drug is being studied for potential medical benefits.
Got it.
The second type is research that is either conducted by or receives funding from major government health and defense agencies like HHS DoD or the VA.
Okay, so if the research has the potential to help people medically, or if it's got the backing of these big government agencies, the approval process could be faster.
Exactly.
What if a researcher already has experience working with these kinds of substances?
Well, for researchers who are already registered to conduct research with either Schedule I or Schedule II substances, the process is even faster. They can actually start their research under these faster procedures just 30 days after they notify the Attorney General.
Wow.
But this notification has to include some key information, like the chemical name and the amount of the fentanyl-related substance they're going to be using, evidence that their research falls into one of those fast-track categories we talked about.
Yeah.
Like a grant number or an IND application number.
Okay.
And proof that they have the necessary authorization to conduct the research at the state level.
30 days is a lot faster than I would have thought for something like this.
Right. It's a pretty significant difference.
What about researchers who don't have those existing registrations?
Oh,
like
sure.
they're new to working with this kind of stuff.
For researchers who don't currently have a Schedule 1 or higher research registration, their notification to the Attorney General is treated as an application.
Okay.
A full application for research registration.
Got it.
In that case, the Attorney General has 45 days to either grant that registration or issue an order to show cause as to why they might deny it.
45 days still seems pretty quick.
It is.
And the bill also says they can submit these things electronically, right?
Yes. The bill makes it very clear that the Attorney General has to set up a way for researchers to submit these notifications electronically,
Okay.
which it definitely helps speed things up.
Now, are there any limits on how much of these schedule fentanyl-related substances a researcher can have if they're using these expedited rules?
Yeah, there are limits.
Yeah.
Researchers using these special procedures can only possess the specific amounts that they outlined in their initial notification to the Attorney General,
Okay.
or in any follow-up notifications if they need more for their research.
Okay.
So any requests for extra amounts would have to be justified and, fit with their overall research plan.
Makes sense. So to be clear, these changes to research registration, do they affect the existing rules for importing or exporting controlled substances for research?
No, the bill is actually very clear on that point. These new provisions for research registration don't affect any of the existing requirements or procedures for importing or exporting controlled substances.
Got it.
Those are still under separate regulations.
Okay, so those stay the same. Lastly, on this research front, the bill calls for a study and report from the Department of Justice's Inspector General. What's that all about?
So basically, within 1 year of the HALT Fentanyl Act becoming law, the Inspector General of the DOJ has to conduct a study and then submit a report to Congress.
Okay.
And this report is going to focus specifically on research involving fentanyl that's been conducted under these expedited procedures.
Okay.
And the goal is probably to, figure out if these faster processes are working,
Right.
see if there are any problems,
Makes sense.
and basically help inform any future policy decisions.
So it's a way to make sure that while they're speeding up research, they're also keeping a close eye on how it's being done.
Exactly.
The bill also mentions streamlining research activities.
Wow.
What does that mean?
That part of the bill has a few measures in it that are designed to make the day-to-day logistics of conducting research with controlled substances a little bit easier
Okay.
for both research institutions and the scientists themselves.
Got it.
One key provision allows agents or employees of a research institution to conduct research with controlled substances under the institution's existing registration, which might be held by another researcher within that same organization.
So not every single person working on a research project with these substances needs to have their own registration.
Right, they don't all need their own individual registration.
What are the conditions for that?
So there are a few conditions.
Okay.
First, the agent or employee has to be acting within the normal scope of their job.
Right.
Second, there has to be another agent or employee at that same institution who is registered to conduct research with a controlled substance in that same schedule.
Okay.
Third, that registered researcher has to tell the Attorney General about the unregistered agent or employee, giving their name, their title, the institution, all of that,
Got it.
and basically authorize them to do research under their registration.
Okay.
And lastly, the Attorney General has 30 days to object to this arrangement if they have any concerns.
So that could really simplify things inside a research lab while still maintaining oversight?
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
What else is there in terms of streamlining? I see something about a single registration for multiple sites.
Right, so this provision allows researchers to conduct research under just one federal registration, even if the research is taking place in more than one physical location.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But there are some limitations. All research sites have to be in the same city or county,
Okay.
and they all have to be under the control of the same institution, organization, or agency.
Got it.
And most importantly, the researcher has to tell the Attorney General about each specific location where the research is going to be conducted or where the controlled substances will be stored or used
Okay.
before anything starts at that location. And the Attorney General can also make regulations to make sure the controlled substances are handled and secured properly across all these different locations.
That could be really helpful for universities or, large research organizations that have facilities in different spots on a campus or within a local area.
Right, it's designed to make things easier for those kinds of situations.
The bill also talks about inspections. How are they being streamlined?
So the bill tries to avoid what could be seen as redundant inspections.
Okay.
So if a researcher is already registered to conduct research with one controlled substance, and then they apply to do research with a different substance that's in the same schedule, or even a higher schedule,
Yeah.
meaning a potentially lower risk of abuse,
Okay.
a new inspection of their registered research location is usually not required.
So if they've already shown they can handle one controlled substance securely, they're probably good to go for others that are similar or lower risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about trusting that they already have the right procedures in place.
But the Attorney General can still do an inspection if they think it's needed, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Attorney General still has the power to conduct an inspection if they think it's necessary
Okay.
to make sure everything is being controlled properly.
So it's all about reducing unnecessary bureaucracy, but still making sure that the necessary oversight is there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's finding that right balance.
What happens if a substance that a researcher is already studying gets added to Schedule 1?
Right.
That could really mess up research that's already in progress.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the bill actually addresses that specific situation.
Okay, good.
So if a substance a researcher is actively studying is added to Schedule Y, and that researcher already has a Schedule I registration for other substances, they get a 90-day window to submit an application to either register to handle the new substance or modify their existing registration to include it. And importantly, they're allowed to continue their research with that newly scheduled substance during that 90-day period, and even beyond, until their application is withdrawn or the Attorney General issues an order to deny it.
Wow.
And if there's a denial and the researcher requests a hearing, that hearing has to be expedited, usually within 45 days.
That's good. So it gives researchers time to adjust, and it prevents research from being stopped immediately just because of these scheduling changes.
Exactly. It's designed to keep the research moving forward.
And the last thing on streamlining has to do with manufacturing activities that are part of research. What kind of manufacturing are we talking about here?
So this recognizes that researchers often need to do things with the substances they're studying as part of their research.
Right.
And it allows registered researchers to do what the bill calls manufacturing activities coincident to research.
Okay.
Things like making extracts or tinctures or solutions or developing different dosage forms, all with the substances they're already researching without needing a separate manufacturing registration. But these activities and the amounts of substances involved have to be described in their research notifications or protocols.
Got it.
And it's important to note that this exception doesn't apply to growing marijuana.
Okay, so it's really about the small-scale work that's necessary for the research itself.
Right.
Not large-scale production or anything like that.
Exactly.
Now, there's a section on transparency regarding special procedures. What's that all about?
This section says that the Attorney General has to be open and public about any controlled substances where the research application process or the criteria for approval are different
Okay.
compared to other substances that are in the same schedule.
Got it.
And they have to make this information public,
Okay.
including posting it on the DEA website. And this has to include identifying those specific substances, detailing the unique processes and criteria, and explaining how those differ from the standard procedures.
Okay.
And this information has to be posted as soon as the Attorney General decides on it, even if nobody has submitted applications for those substances yet.
So researchers know if there are special rules or hurdles they need to deal with for specific substances.
Exactly. It's all about transparency and making sure everyone's on the same page.
Okay, let's talk about the penalties associated with these new fentanyl-related substances.
Right.
What does the bill say about that?
So the bill changes the penalty sections of both the Controlled Substances Act and the Controlled Substances Import and Export Act.
Okay.
And it adds fentanyl-related substances to those sections, alongside this really long chemical name that basically refers to certain fentanyl analogs.
Okay.
And this basically increases the penalties for trafficking in these newly defined substances.
So the penalties for dealing in these fentanyl-related substances will be just as tough as the penalties for dealing in those existing fentanyl analogs.
That's the idea.
And the bill adds a definition of fentanyl-related substance to the Controlled Substances Act, right?
Yes.
Just to make sure everyone's clear on what that means.
Right, and that definition refers back to that detailed structural definition we talked about in Schedule A.
So it's all about clarity and consistency in how these substances are defined and how violations will be penalized.
Exactly. It's laying down the law in a clear way.
Okay, when do all these changes actually go into effect?
Okay, so the bill says that all these amendments apply starting from the date it's enacted into law, which, according to the bill itself, is March 14th, 2025.
Okay.
Based on when it passed the Senate.
Got it.
And this applies no matter when the final regulations for the act are actually put in place.
So the changes take effect as soon as the bill becomes law.
That's right.
And how long does the Attorney General have to create those rules?
The Attorney General has 6 months from the date of enactment to issue the rules for implementing the act.
Okay.
And the bill allows these rules to be issued as what are called interim final rules, which means they can go into effect immediately without needing to first show good cause.
Got it.
But even though they can go into effect right away, interested parties will still have the chance to comment on these rules.
Okay.
And request a hearing before they become final.
So it allows for quick action, but there's still a chance for public input.
Exactly.
Let's shift gears and talk about the Congressional Budget Office's analysis.
Okay.
What did they have to say about the potential costs and mandates of this bill?
So the CBO estimates that enacting S331 would have a pretty small financial impact over a 10-year period from 2025 to 2035.
Okay.
They're projecting a $1 million increase in both government revenues and in direct spending.
$1 million over 10 years doesn't seem like a lot.
Right, it's a pretty small amount overall.
What about the cost of the government actually implementing this bill?
The CBO expects the Department of Justice to have some costs for administration and personnel, less than $500,000 total from 2025 to 2030.
Okay.
To write that report on fentanyl research and to create those regulations for the act.
Right.
But they also note that this spending depends on Congress actually appropriating the funds for it.
So financially, the CBO doesn't see this bill as a huge impact?
No, not right.
But they also looked at whether the bill creates any mandates, right?
They did.
What did they find?
They found that making the temporary Schedule I classification permanent does create both an intergovernmental mandate affecting state and local governments
Okay.
and a private sector mandate
Got it.
under something called the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act.
Okay.
And this is because it extends an existing requirement. The need for people handling these substances to keep up with Schedule I registration and all those regulations.
Even though that temporary scheduling was already in place.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
By making it permanent, the bill keeps that obligation going indefinitely
okay.
for anyone who handles or researches these substances.
Got it.
But the CBO also says that the costs of complying with this mandate,
Okay.
mainly the annual Schedule I registration fee, would be small
Okay.
and wouldn't reach the level that triggers the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act
Got it.
for both government and private entities.
Okay.
They point out that right now, that registration fee is less than $300 a year. And not a lot of researchers have those specific registrations. A lot of public sector researchers don't even have to pay the fees at all.
So it's technically a mandate, but the CBO doesn't think it'll be a huge financial burden.
That's what they're saying.
The last part of the bill is a section called Sense of Congress. What's that about?
That part says that Congress agrees with a specific court case
Okay.
called United States v. McRae.
Right.
And this case was about how to understand the definition of analog drugs.
Okay.
So by including this sense of Congress statement, it means that lawmakers want the courts to use a similar understanding when they interpret this new law's definition of fentanyl-related substances.
Interesting. So they're trying to align with that previous court case.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we've been discussing this, HALT Fentanyl Act is a big step toward permanently classifying a huge range of fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I.
Right.
It's a clear sign that the government wants to tackle this crisis head-on.
Yeah.
The bill also includes those provisions to make research easier.
Yeah. Although under specific conditions, of course.
Of course.
And the CBO says that the financial impact of the bill itself might be relatively small, although it does make those existing regulatory mandates permanent.
What's really interesting to me is just how proactive this legislation is trying to be. You know, by defining and scheduling this whole class of related substances, even ones that might not even be a problem yet.
Right.
It feels like they're trying to get ahead of the curve to try to control potential threats in the future.
Right.
And it really shows this constant tension between needing to control these substances and the need for research.
For sure.
To really understand and address this issue.
Absolutely. So what stands out to you the most about these changes? How do you think this permanent scheduling might affect law enforcement out in the real world? And what about the bigger conversation around drug policy? And we touched on those faster research provisions.
Yeah.
How do you see that balance between control and the need for scientific understanding. This legislation raises a really big question about how far these definitions can reach and, what the unintended consequences might be because of that really broad definition of fentanyl-related substances.
Yeah.
What happens when new chemical compounds pop up that have similar structures? Could this approach accidentally catch substances that are actually useful for research or industry, even if they're not dangerous?
Right.
It's a really complex issue.
For sure.
And this bill is a pretty big step into uncharted territory.
Definitely a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in to this deep dive into the HALT All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.